Hi, everybody's here. Thank you so much for joining the live panel at the end of our Design and Exclusion conference. I'm Amy. I'm the voice that you have been hearing all day long. So we are here at the MIT Media Lab with John Maeda, Global Head of Design and Inclusion for Automattic. Welcome. And also Nathan Matias, who is a PhD candidate here at the MIT Center for Civic Media. Thank you guys so much for being here. Ethan Zuckerman, who was going to join us today, had a family emergency and won't be here, but I think we're going to have a really good conversation. So my first question is, there's been some intense things discussed and a lot of conversation happening online. So any kind of first responses, surprises from the day, things that stood out to you guys?
Well, I'm glad we're having it. It's been great to read the criticism. And when I say criticism, I'm not saying negativity. It's ideas. You're missing this, you're missing this, you're missing this, you're missing this, you're missing this. And thank goodness this, thank goodness that. Right. And so having the conversation means that it's valid. It's important to have.
Right.
I've been really encouraged to see the range of ideas that people have brought to these discussions, from questions of research to discussions of decisions and what we can do about things, the role of designers, but also the role that everyday people who use platforms and technologies play to make a difference.
Right. I think one of the things that has stuck with me through this is that everybody has felt excluded, right? Like that this is not a phenomenon or a feeling that's unique to them. So I actually thought maybe we could start off here with, tell us a time that you guys have felt excluded. I can tell you mine to share if you want. I brought my t-shirt. Scarlett, Emma, Tilda, and Matt. These are all times that white actors have played Asian roles on film. So I felt excluded every time one of those movies came out.
Wow, cool t-shirt.
Thank you. But I would like to hear from you guys.
Wow, so almost 10 years ago now was the first time that I stepped inside of the gates of this college at Cambridge University that ended up becoming my home for 2 years. And as a young person with a Guatemalan background, who was one of the first people in my family to get a college degree, I can remember going up to this gate and talking to this gentleman in a hat who was a porter, whose job it was quite literally to decide who was able to go in and who was not. And I just couldn't get my emotions around the fact that I was actually allowed to be there, because there was this architecture that was designed to be exclusive. And for most of my life, I'd been on the outside of those kinds of architectures. Right. And it was an amazing experience to feel that, but also to realize that there are all sorts of other architectures in our world that give people that experience on a daily basis.
Wow, that's really interesting. Yeah, the literal gatekeeper. And you're like, what? How did I get here? And what happens when I cross through that threshold? Do I leave everybody else behind? Which is a really scary concept as well. John, what about you?
Well, I've been thinking about this topic of inclusion and exclusion for a while now, and I realize that how I feel doesn't matter very much. What matters to me more is hearing other people's stories of exclusion. And it's often a story of feeling different. I know that in my work, I've seen how over and over I'll hear people say, well, that person is a white guy, and he doesn't get it because he doesn't know what it's like to be excluded. But I found that those white guys aren't all the same, it turns out. Right. And they can share stories of being excluded. They may not be the same level or tonality of some exclusion that other people feel. Like one of my colleagues was talking about how when he was growing up, he was very shy. And when you're shy, I was very shy as a kid as well. It's very hard because you don't get to be part of the pack. Right. So you can feel that regardless of who you are.
Right. Well, thank you for sharing that as well. And I love that idea that we can learn so much just by listening. that is the very first step. And it's actually so hard to do because in order to listen, you have to lower so many barriers for yourself. And I can tell what that guy's going to say, or I already have my opinion on this thing. Do I need to hear another one? Well, yeah. You can always listen more and learn from that. So I have here a piece of paper with questions on it collected from the day's conversations online. And I realize the irony of sitting here at the MIT Media Lab with an actual piece of paper and a pen, but we're going with, I know, full analog. So, you know, John, you had mentioned earlier that one of the great things about watching the engagement today around the conversation with design and exclusion was that it was actually really great to see the criticisms. And one of the early ones from our first panels was this idea that creatives are inherently inclusive. And I think a lot of people challenge that online. Yeah. Is that really true? Where does the basis of like your thinking come from on that? So I'd love to hear a little bit more.
Well, I might say it more subjectively. If you're really good creative, you are inclusive.
Right.
And where that comes from is having had the opportunity to work with a lot of top creative people. And they just tend to be more multi. They're more open to something that is different than you might think, whether it be food, clothing, way of life, things they try, things they aren't afraid to try. Over time, I thought that was just a creative thing, but I realized it's an inclusive thing, and inclusivity drives their creativity. Whereas I'll find someone who is, quote unquote, less of a successful creative, it's because they've narrowed themselves to a certain subtype of something, and they're happy there.
Do you think, and this is another question that was raised today in the online conversations, that a person can be both elitist and inclusive? That like a lot of creatives, a lot of designers, like they're very certain about their aesthetic, or they're very certain about their point of view. And you know, we're here in one of the world's greatest research facilities, an incredibly elite organization. And we talked a little bit about this. How can, and your experience, Nathan, of being like, do I belong here? Because this place was created for the elite. How can we be inclusive and also have standards of excellence in some way? Are those different? What does that mean for both of you?
So, you know, I often think about some of the great stories of citizen science when asking this question, because even going back to the 19th century, someone like Ellen Swallow Richards, she was a chemist and actually one of the founders of the field of home economics, who was one of the first MIT grad students, was one of the first MIT faculty, and she realized that if you broaden who can do science, then you can make discoveries that go well beyond what any one individual like great scientist might do. One example of her work, she supported people to collect over 40,000 water samples from across Massachusetts and did the first data analysis of the chemistry of the water supply.
Oh my God, she was like the original Erin Brockovich.
This is really amazing. And then using that, like they created some of the first municipal sewage systems in America because they were able to work together with people who had perspectives and data that people here at MIT just didn't have access to, however knowledgeable they might be.
When you say that, and coming to my original comment about, you know, if you're a good creative, that is an elitist take. And I was at this elitist place for a long time. And the reason why I left these places was to learn more.
No shade to MIT, we love it.
It's great. But I began wondering, what can I learn from people that are way younger than me? What can I learn from someone who is quote unquote less educated than me? Because most of my learning about design came from my father, who didn't have a high school education. And so I've always wondered about that. So how do we learn from everyone?
Where is wisdom?
Exactly.
And it's in pockets all over the place.
It's everywhere.
We were talking about earlier, I think, and this has come up a lot, like, does inclusivity mean that you have to be inclusive of You can bleep this, assholes. Like, do we have to be inclusive of racist people? Do we have to be inclusive of every idea? And I think I mean, it's a tension point, right? Like, it's something I think that every community needs to think of, that every industry needs to think of. What's the value of having and incorporating every opinion, while also making sure that those opinions don't shape what you're creating. Nathan, you're essentially an expert, as you said, in terrible people and terrible behaviors. And so one question that I have for you is, why, it's more of a psychology question, I guess, why do people feel so invested in their right to say terrible things?
Yeah, I think one of the challenges around getting our heads around this is to just understand the scale and the source of the kinds of problems that we face online. Around 47% of Americans have experienced some kind of online harassment.
Right.
And when we think about problems like harassment, trolling, discrimination, yes, there are sometimes like people and groups who do this kind of thing in a dedicated, coordinated fashion. But there's also research showing that any of us, under the right circumstances, we've already heard from people talking about unconscious biases. Even consciously, if we think that the people around us are okay with certain behavior that is unkind or discriminatory to us, then we often follow the crowd.
Right, it becomes permissive. It's easy
Exactly.
to do. Right.
And so when we think about what to do about these problems, sometimes it's possible to draw the line and just not include people who are consistently aggressive towards others or consistently harm others. We also need to be thinking about social change and how we can change the overall cultures so that people realize that treating people in unfair ways and acting badly towards them is not okay.
Right. I think that idea that, is it an active or inactive? Is it like and it gets to that question of intentionality that came up again and again during the conference. Like, if you're intentionally excluding, is that equal or worse than unintentionally excluding? I think a theme that arose a couple times throughout the online engagement was one that in the conference we didn't speak a lot about how technology and design exclude people with disabilities. And maybe we can speak a little bit to that. Is that one of design's big lacunas, which, John, is a word that you taught me.
Which I learned from Erin McKean, who was on
the panel.
I was so glad that point was raised. The question of why aren't we talking about accessibility? Why isn't there a person on the panel who represents that point of view? I acknowledge that. And I think, oh, darn, next time around. But the next thing I ask is, what is accessibility? One thing I've been talking about a lot, because I used to work with AARP when I was in my 30s, about how the thing you don't realize, I was lucky in my 30s to realize what life is after 50. So now that I'm 50, I'm like, oh, that's what I was talking about back then.
There's life after 50.
But there was all this data that I was looking at that was talking about legibility, how your eyes do degrade over time. It's a universal thing.
Right.
And so when I get older, I'm the first person in my company to ask, I can't read that. I can't read that. And, I was like, and if it's someone who's in the 30s, like, of course I can read it.
Right.
And I'm like, I could read it back then. So different kind of accessibility, invisible things like that do exist. But that said, it's a much broader range.
What does accessibility mean to you in looking at conversations? Or is there a specific segment of the research that you do with online harassment, with freedom of internet issues that addresses people with disabilities?
Yeah, I'd maybe like to step back a little bit and riff on what you said, actually, John. So one way to kind of try to address these challenges as designers is to bring more people into the work of design, whether that's who we include as staff or who we include in the process of the research we do, and like who actually does the design. Earlier we've heard from the folks at Nextdoor about how they worked with social movements, groups like Neighbors for Racial Justice, who at the beginning it wasn't necessarily clear whether they were going to be partners or whether they were going to be opponents
Right.
at that stage. But Nextdoor found a way to work more closely with them to design things together. There's a new book by Meryl Alper about inclusion and design, particularly around autism. And she's found through her kind of deep ethnographies that sometimes kind of technology designs that we think are quick wins that solve the design challenge around accessibility actually create other problems for people that we might not see unless we actually involve them in the design process. And so I'd encourage folks to look at Meryl's book and learn from the community she's been listening to in her research.
Right. It's always interesting, too.
Sorry, there's a question about AARP. What is it? It's a national organization that used to be focused on quote-unquote retired people. It's in DC based, but it's national as well. And it's where I began to learn about how I was hanging out with them one day, and they were saying—
Power of the olds.
Power of the olds. And I saw it firsthand when it was like, you know, you're 70, you're old. No, I'm not 70. The person over there, 80, he's old. You're the 80-year-old person like, oh, I'm not old. The person over there, she's 90, she's old. So it's
God
all
bless these 90-year-olds.
relative.
Right. I think it's also, I mean, both of you raise a great point here about even being careful about who is they, who is us, who is we. You know, it's always easiest to make the we the smallest possible circumference, right? Like the we is all of us in this room, the we are the people in this conversation, but that automatically creates the they. So how do we actually get out of that? Like what, is it a language issue? Is it it's a design problem, right? Like how do we reach the they? Who is the they? And how do they become the we? Now I'm starting to sound like a crazy person. But I think this is actually part of this, you know, where does inclusion end? Like in the real world, how do we actually make design and work in an inclusive manner when there are real world limitations? So this is again a theme that came up in the online conversations today was, well, if you have a limited budget, if you have 5 priorities, if you have a target customer, how do you design for them and make sure that you deliver without having to exclude?
Well, first of all, when I began this work, I realized the word crazy is a bad word to use. But again, when I say bad, I didn't know it. We don't know it. Another word I use is like, hey, you guys.
Guys, I say it a lot. I apologize.
And so just want to note that once you're aware, you can suddenly be afraid to say things. And so I'm glad we opened a space where we're going to say all kind of things. And one thing I loved hearing the discussion about that particular question of, so if you only have budget X, and X can only apply to 5 things, and if your MVP, your minimum viable product is a minimum, you're targeting a minimum group of people. So that's like a math problem. And then there was something about like, why is this conversation about business and like the financial advantage with inclusivity? I always say they're all connected together. So imagine the following. Yes, we have budget X. It's going to produce Y. But now I'm going to tell you that if we were to be more inclusive, we can approach this group with this kind of design mentality. We're going to make more money. So now what happens is the budget opens up.
Right.
So when I frame it as not as a zero-sum thing, it's how we argue for a larger addressable market as a good investment. That's how we can do this, I believe.
I think often people think about like user research as excursions into the world to answer questions or solve the problem right in front of us.
Right.
When often we're up against these deeper and like longer term issues. Ethan earlier in the conversation talked about how companies can invest not just the majority of their money in the engineering problems, which they think are hard, but also in the human problems, which are probably even harder than the engineering ones. And often what I've been doing in my research has been to explore the ways that we can like build the relationships with the people who do and don't yet use the platforms we're creating so that that relationship is there for ongoing learning, whether it's the kind of relationships that people build with, I think of Twitter's and Facebook's relationships with NGOs on issues of diversity and harassment, where they built councils or advisory groups. Or in the case of Reddit and many other platforms, actually delegating power to your users so that you can then have an ongoing conversation with them about the ways that they're using the software you provide to solve like their evolving challenges in new ways.
Right. What do you think are the biggest obstacles to finding those solutions? Are they I mean, like, is it technology? Is it design? Is it mindset? Is it changing hearts and minds to make inclusivity a priority?
I believe it's all changing hearts and minds. It's having leaders, the people, quote unquote, in power, considering it as an important thing for social justice reasons and also for economic impact reasons. It requires you to listen and care. For instance, I noticed when I came into the company I'm at, Automattic, there was a large group of automaticians, Automattic employees, talking about LGBTQ matters and how do we care and talk about them more. So I can't help but want to care about them more.
Right.
It's because I've been trained to listen to my customers. My customers can be people inside the organization and outside. And I found that's actually advantageous. But most leaders haven't had that reckoning. I had it here at MIT because I used to lead race and relations issues as a younger professor. And I began realizing, oh my gosh, the world is really not as engineering oriented as I thought. F of X equals Y is really good, but doesn't apply to all kinds of people, you know? So that's where I had it, but that was when in my early 30s.
Do you think people can seek that sort of revelation out? Maybe they're having one right now?
I think they're having a few right now. I think they are. I mean, when I saw Nate's work, I mean, I really met him on Twitter. Maybe half a year ago, I was like, oh my gosh, who is this person? Whoa, he's doing this kind of work. I love this work. Quick, reach out to him on Twitter. Okay, I'm not a troll in this case. And he kind of came out, and then he talked to our company.
Thank you.
And I learned more about his work, and I realized this kind of work is the kind of work we should be championing across the board. Not just for social justice concerns, again, extremely valid, but this is sound business practice. This is 21st century business practice. Let's embrace it.
Can I add to that?
Oh yeah, of course.
So I think I completely agree with you, John, that having that recognition all the way to the top is incredibly important. There was a recent article in the Harvard Business Review, a bit kind of disappointing. They found that in a survey of 350 executives in the United States, that people who were involved in inclusion and diversity efforts didn't get better performance reviews from the people who were evaluating them. So it's clear that we want to live in a world where if we have more inclusive workspaces and workplaces, that those people will be able to represent their perspectives and their view of the world. But that needs to be rewarded, and that has to happen kind of at the very heart of how a company works.
Right.
Yeah. On the other hand, I think also, even as we look at those cultural changes within companies, I do think there's a lot to be learned in the area of just getting evidence for what actually works, which is what a lot of my research has focused on. We have a lot of very good intentions, and as we see people pay more and more attention to this conversation, we'll see even more flowering of great ideas. And as a researcher, and as a researcher, the question then becomes, which of those ideas actually generate the outcomes that we're looking for?
Right.
And that's where research, that's where whether it's experiments or the kind of ethnography we've heard about, can really help us find those best ideas and where they make the most difference.
Well, maybe here's a place that research and leaders and companies can address. This is a question from our audience: is why do companies have such a hard time keeping women and people of color designers around? Is that a cultural issue? Is that a leadership issue? Is it about making the spaces open to women and people of color?
I think it's an empathy issue, and it's something that can be overcome. I found that the way to overcome it is to be me. I discovered I'm an Asian male, and I'm older, so I'll say whatever the heck I want to say.
Remember when you found out you were Asian?
I found out I was Asian, and I was like, oh, I'm Asian. What is this? I didn't notice I was Asian. I thought I was like a white guy, but I'm not. Is that why you were? Oh, I understand now. So, but after discovering my superpower, I will go in and talk to white guys, and I will tell them what I think. And they're like, oh, that makes me uncomfortable. And I said, well, doesn't make me uncomfortable at all. We're talking about it.
Right.
And what happens is, 9 times out of 10, they say, I'm so glad someone can explain this to me. Because I felt excluded from it. And can you help me do better by this?
Right.
Because clearly it makes sense.
I think, I thank you for doing that work. I think the challenge here is that so many women and people of color don't have the agency to do that, or they're in scenarios where they're afraid of being able to say that to their bosses, to their hiring managers, to anybody else in the office, and so they're kind of consistently either put on the defensive. I can say we feel on the defensive, or in some ways always needing to prove our value without sending too many ripples through the water. So what do you think about that? I mean, like, what are ways in which people can feel empowered to speak up for themselves more?
Gee, I don't know. Do you
Well, I
have an
think
answer?
the workplace questions aren't central to my research, but one area that I study is this area of social norms. And when we talk about changing a culture, we're often talking about influencing how people treat each other by influencing what they think other people consider to be acceptable. So if you think that there's a norm of treating people as equals and respecting the contributions of anyone, whoever they happen to be, then you're more likely to act in that way. There's a great literature review of this by Betsy Paluck and Donald Green, that if you want to dive into the decades of research on this, you can. And
I'd rather be sitting here just talking to you.
one of the interesting things about social norms is that we're just wired to get those norms from people who are more like us. And so if we want to change how, say, white technical culture treats people of color, one powerful strategy might be to support people who are well respected, who look like and are like the people whose behavior you want to change, to take the lead on modeling and encouraging kind of more inclusive behavior.
Oh, that's interesting.
A simple example is I was at a Sonos thing, and the CEO was talking about his interest in inclusivity and diversity, and someone asked, well, why would you care about it? And I said, well, of course, look at him. He's Canadian. And everyone's laughing like, oh, he's a white guy in America, but he's Canadian. I get it. I'm not American. I'm Canadian. And so if we have empathy for all the kinds of people,
right,
and know that everything is not so digital with 0 and 1, we begin to open it up. And then everyone's horsepower begins to tune up.
Right. Everyone
can be part of this renorming.
I think that idea of renorming and culture shifting, it's very focused on what's happening. How quickly can that happen? I think one of the questions raised during the conference was, so much about thinking about design and technology and inclusivity is about changing the future. But what about now? What can we do now?
It's so hard. This T-shirt you're wearing, it's interesting. I have to get one next. Someone asked me, because I spoke at the 50th anniversary of Star Trek, and someone said to me, oh, who was your favorite character? And of course, oh, it must be Sulu because he was Asian.
Right.
And I'm like, no, it was actually Scotty because he's an engineer. And I wanted to be an engineer, so I went to MIT. But I'll tell you something I realized as I got older. I thought it was strange how when I was a kid, I thought that Sulu talked funny because he didn't speak with a Chinese Asian accent, which is normal on television. I thought, wow, he speaks English like me. Weird.
Right.
So to understand that dissonance is so deep, that permissiveness has been ingrained in certain ways in the media, you're like, feels uncomfortable. Now, shall I get angry? And shall I attack? Or shall I find solutions?
Right.
And I think as I've gotten older, I'm like, I'm really interested in solutions with a bit of hidden anger right over here.
Oh no. We, a great friend of ours at Mashup is Phil Yu, the angry Asian man. He talks about stay angry. It's a great fuel right here. Not big, because you don't want it to eat you. But you do, you know, it helps keep you going. But I think, you know, again, to get to the now of it, you know, maybe, Nathan, can you speak to, are there exciting technologies or exciting new research that's kind of percolating right now that can speak to how the culture is shifting?
Yeah, I think, you know, this question of timescales is such an important one and so challenging. On one hand, it can seem like social change happens at a glacial pace.
So slow.
You know, especially, you know, when we look at employment numbers, you know, we look at, say, women in the tech industry. There's just an article by the head of the ACM, which is Computer Sciences Professional Society, showing how we're pretty much treading water when it comes to women in computer science, not really expanding, at least when it comes to jobs. But on the other hand, we're starting to get research on small things that can have powerful transformations in people's lives. So I think of the recent study that showed that just a few minutes conversation at someone's door about what it's like to be a transgender person can make a significant impact on people's political values and beliefs. And that's something that, you know, was validated in a large field experiment. Or research coming out of Princeton on reducing bullying in school, showing that if you encourage leaders in the different subgroups of a community to reward peacemaking and conflict resolution activities and make those rewards kind of visible to others, that you can create a network effect that, in the case of New Jersey schools, reduced disciplinary reports by 40%. Wow. So we're starting to see some very kind of powerful behavioral interventions on issues that we still acknowledge are going to take a long time to change.
I love that. And I like, you know, I think a lot of the work that Mashup tries to do is combine the two. Like, what is the network effect of amplifying a conversation, or a network effect of amplifying stories that make that show you that who you perceived as to be the other is just as human as you.
There was a few critical points on the stream about why is it we're talking about tech? Why aren't we talking about it more broadly? The reason why is because technology has all the network effect potential in it to achieve change in a matter of days versus years and decades.
Right.
And so that's why you'll see me working very deeply in the tech industry, not because I only care about tech. I love chairs, I love environments, I love all that. But this is the one that can move the fastest and the most economic resources are embedded into it. And the leaders are out there that are wondering, how do I take this idea into our products? And I think some of them have gotten amazing tips from this. And we have a PhD dissertation defense Nate here, who's like the spelling bee champion right now. He has like all the references in his mind. So it's
I
like
know,
having
I'm
an
just like, wait, I hope everybody's writing down all the authors and research he's noting. Well, so this begs a larger question, which just came in from our audience, which is, how do we actually define diversity, inclusion, and exclusion in technology? What are we talking about here? I think we all, you know, and it's actually a great question, which we didn't answer in the beginning of this, which is, you know, here, should there be a consistent definition that the industry can hold all of its companies against?
So there's this classic debate about what is the meaning of representation. And it's not just about race and ethnicity and gender. It's a debate that goes all the way back to what does it mean to be in a democracy. And there are different theories that people have put forward. One theory is that you should have proportional representation.
Right.
If you're inclusive, then you take the percentage of people in society, and if your parliament has that percentage, then you're inclusive. Another looks at, do you have some input from all of the relevant voices, right? And that's going to look very different
And who decides what's relevant?
But then ultimately, I think that there's that question of who decides, and also what is the outcome for people in the end. And in my research, I've been trying to find ways to broaden who gets to ask that question and have real power in shaping the outcomes that matter.
Right. John, is there a definition of inclusion and exclusion at Automattic?
We have, well, I mean, there was a lot of work in the company to make such a page. And it was funny, when I arrived, we're wondering, should we launch this page? I landed in the should we launch this page era. And my answer was, yes, we have to launch the page. And the answer was, why? It's because I'd just spoken with someone who was leaving his faculty position for another university in a different state, a big life change. He's an African-American art professor. And I said, well, why are you moving universities? He said, well, I don't think any place really takes this seriously, but that one I'm moving to, at least they have a diversity inclusion page, at least. And I thought, wow, that's the minimum bar. That's okay. Let's get minimum-y first. Right. And then what was amazing is to find all this energy inside Automattic.
Right.
Ashley, we have Kel, Mel here in the studio. We have more people online from Automattic. They just want to get this out there.
Right.
So we're getting it out there. Now, people all look for a definition. They look for the quote-unquote silver bullet, et cetera. I say there's only the silver ray. The silver ray, you have to keep shining it everywhere and shaking it once in a while and doing it, because it's a never-ending pursuit for something that is very human. And humanity keeps shifting. So we have to move with it, not hope for a perfectly boxed thing. It is, the classical business leader will look for the classically boxed thing because they want to check it off.
Right.
This is not check-offable.
Right. No, I mean, we were discussing this earlier as well, is that becoming more inclusive, becoming more empathetic as an institution and as people, it's not something that you can pass a test, get an A on, and then move on.
Oh my gosh,
You're just always evolving. So it's always going to be hard, right? It's always going to be a challenge.
It means you're always going to screw up.
Right.
Because if you are in your box and you're happy and eating the same thing and knowing the same people, you rarely mess up. When you come out here and the stuff that I've seen Nate research, I'm like, oh, it's hard. Oh my gosh, look, you're gonna step into, oh, ouch, you know?
Right.
Doing that is uncomfortable, and so I can only say if you're feeling uncomfortable, it means you're actually living in this space.
Right.
And congratulations.
Yeah. Well, welcome everybody to this uncomfortable space. One question that was raised earlier today, and I think we danced around it a little bit in the panels, was the kind of distinction between institutional responsibility, industry responsibility, and personal responsibility. Yeah. What is your take on that? Is making the industry more inclusive, each of everybody in this room, everybody, it's us, it's on us to do it. And also, how do we keep from making it too personal, even if we're taking personal responsibility, to not always be defensive or to not always see what's lacking when it comes to our representation or our point of view?
That is one of the hardest questions. I think in my work, there are a few directions to think about. Can you repeat the question again? Because
sure.
I don't want to lose the thread.
No,
it's
so
so important.
Whose responsibility is it, right? Is it individual? Is it industry-wide, or is it institution-wide, within companies? Yeah,
so when we think about online harassment, there are all of these layers. So governments have one role to play because government's there to protect the common good. Platforms take varying levels of responsibility and really struggle to find and negotiate that spot where they're taking care of people, they're managing their liability, but they're also not overstepping, their power to like govern and shape human behavior. And that creates a space for people to step in. And that work, whether people are volunteer moderators, like those that Ethan was talking about, or even just the bystanders who intervene in some way. Right. Actually, over 60% of all people who witness some kind of harassment report that they've stepped in and done something, like support the person being harassed, respond to the alleged harasser, report things on the like flagging button on the social media platform. And as like recent research from Data Society shows, it's often people who are the most vulnerable who do that work. And so on one hand, there are like over 100 million Americans who have stepped up to like protect inclusive conversations. But on the other hand, there are these like challenging questions about, to what degree should we expect or rely on like everyday people to do things that could be platforms' responsibilities? And that's going to be an ongoing negotiation, I think.
Right.
I think it's always personal. I think it has to start with you and what you want to do. And then you are lucky to find people who are not necessarily like-minded, but like-oriented, like Ashley Axios.
She is the chair of this conference, and she was the moderator.
And the simple idea is not simple. She jumped in, passionate, got a whole posse together of people with you, and just bouncing off of things that I saw on the internets, and Ethan and MIT, because the importance of the Media Lab is not to be overlooked, because the Media Lab stands for world peace. It was co-founded by a gentleman who worked on the Manhattan Project, who saw a purely scientific viewpoint could destroy the world, therefore had to be counterbalanced by the arts. And so that is inclusivity. That is a kind of diversity. Right. And this is where I learned it, and it's still practiced in a almost new doctorate like this over here with Nate.
You're fresh, about to enter into the world, Nathan. Pretty crazy. So very exciting. Well, so I think we have time for one more question, which will be mine, which is, we're talking about personal responsibility, our roles in shifting culture, our roles in building tools and technology that can amplify and have the network effect of shifting culture. What is your single piece of advice for people entering into this now? Take a minute.
Don't look away.
Don't look away.
I'd say don't just listen, but like respond and follow the requests and instincts of the people you serve.
That is so great. Don't look away and continue to serve. I love that. Well, thank you so much, Nathan, and the MIT Center for Civic Media. Thank you, John,
Thank you.
and Automattic.
Thank you, Amy.
If you like everything that you see here and have heard from me, we are convening these conversations and amplifying them as well at mashupamericans.com. You can listen to our podcast at itunes.com/mashup.
Check it out.
Definitely. John was on it. You can listen to our episode with him. And everybody, please continue to push hard and push us in this conversation. I think we'll keep the hashtag going. The site will be up and live for a while, x.design.blog, and hashtag DesignX. Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.